Bible to the Old Testament, to the Old Testament book of Ruth. Old Testament book of Ruth. It's a small little book, 4 chapters. It is one of my favorites in the Old Testament, and one of my favorites in the Bible, in fact. And I think sometimes it's because I gravitate towards the little books because I can read them all at one sitting. And I can read through them. But Ruth is a fantastic little book. It is well written. There's a lot of stuff going on in Ruth that if you study it and study it, you can just keep going deeper and deeper and deeper, because there's a lot of symbolism in the book. There's a lot of things going on with the choice of words and language and the way it's constructed that makes it just a fascinating little book to read and to study. Today we're going to look at verse 6 and then follow down through a couple of paragraphs there. Have you had time to find it? Ruth chapter 1 verse 6. She being Naomi, and her daughters-in-law set out to return from the territory of Moab, because she had heard in Moab that the Lord had paid attention to his people's need by providing them food. So she left the place where she had been living, accompanied by her 2 daughters-in-law, and traveled along the road leading back and forth to the land. Let me set up the story just a little bit in case you're not familiar with it. Naomi and her husband Elimelech had been living in Bethlehem. That was their hometown. But the community had been going through a drought and there wasn't a lot of food. They'd heard that there was food over in Moab, and so they picked up the family, took the 2 boys, and they went to Moab to live. Now, part of the intricacies of the story is that Elimelech's name means "my God is king." And it's interesting that when he went to Moab, he was actually physically putting himself in a position that said God is not king. For if his king had been God, he would have stayed in Bethlehem, which means the house of bread or the house of food. In other words, had Elimelech really been living for God like he should, he would have put his trust in God. He'd have stayed home and he would have let God provide for his needs. But instead, he went somewhere else. Part of the neatness of the story, things that are cool, was those 2 boys that they had, Mahlon and Chilion, and their names actually meant sickly and weak. Now, no mama's going to take a look at her son and say, "Oh, I believe I'm going to name you sickly," or "I think I'm going to name you weak," or it could be failing. Okay, so what do we have here? Probably names that describe them more than their actual names. We have a descriptive term and maybe a nickname. And so that's how they were known. And sure enough, after they had moved to Moab, the boys grew up, but they didn't live a long time. They both died before they could have children. And so sickly and weak grew up, married, and died. And now, some years later, I think it's 10 years later, Naomi has learned that God has blessed Bethlehem well enough that she wants to move back. Her husband's gone, he has died, her boys are gone, it's just her and the 2 daughters-in-law, and she's heard that God is blessing, and so it is time for her to move back. And as she does go back, the girls go with her, and they travel with her down the road. That's where it tells us. And I think it's important that we understand both daughters were on the journey. The 2 daughter-in-laws traveled along the road leading back to the land of Judah. Naomi said to them, "Each of you go back to your mother's home. May the Lord show kindness to you as you have shown to the dead and to me. And may the Lord grant each of you rest in the house of a new husband." And she blessed them, and they wept loudly. Naomi is being kind here. And I think that the whole essence of this first chapter is to show us, at least in part, the kindness and sweetness of heart that Naomi had. She was giving the daughters permission to go and to marry again. You see, they were part of her household. They were to be a part of Naomi's family and to help take care of her, but she's giving them permission to go and remarry. I learned just this last year, not too many months ago, that after my daddy died and my mom remarried, that there were certain members of our family, not the immediate family, that really took issue with that. They didn't want Mom to remarry. They didn't want her to move outside the immediate family realm. I didn't know that. I mean, my dad had been gone for 2 years. Here she is as a parent of 4 little boys. She finds a man that loves her and is going to accept 4 sons and come into his family. It seemed kind of like storybook, you know. It was all good. I was really surprised. Here I am in my 60s to discover that there were certain folks closely in our family, not distant relatives, that really didn't like the idea that she was going to remarry. And yet it worked well, worked very well. So I can really understand Naomi's kindness here in saying to the girls, look, you're young ladies, you're not gonna wait around. You need to get married. Stay home. And I think we see the sweetness and kindness of Naomi in this. The daughters-in-law said to her, we insist on returning with you to your people. And now the big argument comes. She's going to tell them why they need to stay home. Naomi replied, return home, my daughters. Why do you want to go with me? Am I able to have any more sons who could become your husbands? Return home, my daughters. Go on, for I am too old to have another husband. And even if I thought there was still hope for me to have a husband tonight and to bear sons, would you be willing to wait for them to grow up? Would you restrain yourselves from remarrying? You see, the culture that Naomi was in and the culture of Moab apparently were very, very similar. Well, they were neighbors. They were close to each other geographically. And apparently the culture was such that when Naomi described what we know as Levirate marriage, the girls knew what she was talking about, knew that was part of it. Now, the culture in that time said that if a young lady marries and her husband dies before she has children, it's the responsibility of the deceased man's brothers to marry her and to raise up children for his brother, so that the name and the heritage and the family tradition would go on. There's no indication here in this story that this was a foreign concept to Ruth and to Orpah. They were right there. And so she's saying to them, are you going to wait? If I got married today and I had a son a year from now, would you wait for him to grow up and be of marriageable age? Can you imagine that? How many years the wait would have been, and then the age discrepancies, and what if Naomi had a baby and it was a girl? And then they had to wait again, and then they had to do it twice, once for each. The only thing you could hope for is twins and come early, you know. But even then, you're talking 14, 15, 16, 17, 20 years before marriage would take place. And so the cultural background here is very similar. And that's important to understand, too, because of the total background of the story itself. She went to Moab, and she left the presence of God, but she was still with people that understood her, and she understood them, and they understood the dynamics of what was going on. Well, so she says, go on. And there at the end of that verse I just read, no, my daughters, my life is much too bitter for you to bear, because the Lord's hand has turned against me. And again, they wept loudly. And Orpah kissed her mother-in-law. In other words, bye, I will go home. But Ruth clung to her. And Naomi said, look, your sister-in-law has gone back to her people. And you might want to note the next little phrase there. She's gone back to her people and to her, you got it? Gods. That's critical in this story. And it's especially important with the message that I'm sharing with you today. She went back to her people and to her gods. Follow your sister-in-law. You see, back then, gods were associated with localities. They were associated either with countries or even communities. It would be like Upton has a god, and Sonora serves a different god, and Glendale a different god. Now let's go south. Bonneville, another God. Mumfordville, another still. Now, if it's a regional God, like Yahweh, or like some of the others, then they would have these regional entities. But the idea of God was associated with place. That's why when you read about conflicts in the Old Testament, you would find it's not just two peoples who war against each other, but it's one God versus another God. And they considered that whoever won the conflict, well, their God was bigger and better than your God, therefore your God lost. That's even depicted in the old movie with the Ten Commandments. And you remember as Moses came in and presented the claims of Yahweh, they had there in Pharaoh's temple, if you remember the movie, there was a big black statue of the Egyptian God. And when Pharaoh came in after one of those visits by Moses, what had happened to the statue of the foreign god? You remember, some of you? It was on its face on the ground. My God is bigger than your God. And so when Orpah went back to her home, she was going back to her God. But Ruth clung to Naomi, and so as she moved back to Bethlehem with her mother-in-law, she was leaving her God, or gods as it says here, in order to move into a new territory. Guess what? New God. She was going to have to change her faith because of her commitment, not only to her mother-in-law, but to where she was living. We have a similar thing that takes place in the New Testament. Do you remember the story of the Philippian jailer? He gets saved by the Apostle Paul. He gets saved by Jesus, but the Apostle Paul has ministered to him. And it says he got saved, and he went home, and it says his wife and his whole family got saved as well. And that's been one of those stories where people, well, now, how did that happen kind of automatically? Well, the first answer would be, he got radically saved. He went home and he led his wife and kids to the Lord. And that's quite possibly what happened. But it's also true that this could happen. As head of household, when he got saved, they had to follow Jesus too. They didn't have a choice, because Daddy's God was the God of the whole family. Now, there's still witnessing and still teaching and still preaching and still baptisms and all the things that go on. But what we see here is the picture of Daddy gets saved, and he witnesses and leads his whole family to the Lord. They didn't have a choice. That's part of the background that we see even in this passage. So Ruth is committed to staying with Naomi, even when it means changing her gods. But Ruth replied, here's a famous passage, a very famous passage. Don't plead with me to abandon you or to return from following you. For wherever you go, I will go. And wherever you live, I will live. Your people will be my people. How many of you in your wedding service had that scripture as part of your service? Did anybody do that? Nobody? I got one. Thank you. Good. We got two. All right. And three. Oh, that's good. Anybody else use this passage in a wedding? Have you ever heard it in a wedding? Yeah, several of you. I'm getting you get loose. So when I go, I see that hand later. I already got you. So no, laugh with me, please. Okay. What's interesting is while we use this in wedding services, actually quite regularly, it's in my little black minister's manual that I use for weddings and for other things. It's right there. And it has absolutely nothing to do with a wedding. The sentiment is really sweet, and it fits. It doesn't have anything to do with the wedding. It has to do with Ruth saying, listen, I'm going with you. You can't stop me. Your family's now my family. Your God, God of Bethlehem, is my God. That's a huge difference than what her sister-in-law had said, that she cried and sorrowfully left to go back to her family and to her gods. Oh, by the way, I didn't finish reading that passage. Your people will be my people, and your God will be my people. Where you die, I will die, and there I will be buried. She made a permanent commitment to go. May the Lord punish me, and do so severely, if anything but death separates you and me. When Naomi saw that Ruth was determined to go with her, she stopped talking to her. Now, in this translation, that's a rather abrupt ending to the story, to that part of it. But it just simply meant, no more conversation. I can't convince you. Okay, I give in. Come with me. Let's go. And they stopped discussing it. Now, something has happened here that we need to be very much aware of, because this passage shows us in all of its beauty and its sweetness, and I think it is a beautiful and sweet passage. It also gives for us an unintentional impact. Something has happened in this passage that was not intended, it was not written, it was not talked about, but it was nonetheless real. Sometimes we have experiences where we do things and we don't mean for things to come out of it other than what we were expecting, but there is an unintentional side to them, and we have to be careful when we experience these things. I think about it in athletics or in sports. Have you, like me, ever prayed for a team to win? Anybody ever done that? Go ahead and be honest. Bob has, and I have, Larry has, some of the rest of you have. You know, yeah, I want my team to win, and so I pray for my team. Now, what's the unintentional impact of that prayer? You just prayed for the other team to lose. Some of you would say, well, yeah, of course. Hey, I went to E-Town. We didn't like East Hardin. Oops, did I say that? You know, that was a rivalry. Oh my goodness, it was a rivalry. And I actually had a lot of respect personally for East Hardin. I didn't like Meade County. Golly, they were the bad guys. Well, you all understand that, but can you see how when we sometimes do what we want to do, thinking it's right and good, that we have a negative impact somewhere else? We have to be careful with that in all the things that we do. Bernard Cromwell writes a lot of books. I've read several of them. The one I'm thinking about, I don't have a title for it because it took place over 3 or 4 or 5 books. He's writing about the old days in England, before there was an England. King Alfred the Great and the formation of a unified country, and there were Danes and Vikings invading, and there were the Britons and the folks from Wessex and all the other places, and they're all in competition for the same place. But what Cromwell does is he presents some of the priests in the church at the time, because the church was very vibrant, very much alive. Even in those early days, he presents some of the members of the church of the priesthood as just horrible. Now he says that they're building the church, and they're talking about the glory of God, and et cetera, et cetera, et cetera, but they are doing it in such a way is that you or I, either one, if they were our priests, we wouldn't do it. We wouldn't be a part of that church. We wouldn't be a part of that faith. And yet they're going, for the glory of God. Maybe. Probably not. So they could celebrate God and still turn people off, an inadvertent response. Now, Cromwell also does a very good job, in fact, in the same pages, of showing faithful priests. That's the guy or guys that you would read about, and you'd say, yeah, I could follow that priest. I could join that church. I could serve that God. And I've been pondering for years how he could do such a good job showing both sides. But he does. But sometimes, even those of us that stand boldly for God, do it in such a way that there is a negative impact. And we have to be careful, because there's an unintentional thing that sometimes takes place. It's actually in John chapter 3. We see it there too. John chapter 3, verse 16. You all know John 3:16, right? For God so loved the world. I don't have to quote it out. You don't know. But you know what it says in verses 17 and 18? It's not that Jesus came into the world to condemn the world, but rather those that don't believe in Jesus stand condemned already. The opposite side of faith in Christ is no faith in Christ. And there's really no choice. The unintentional thing is you either believe in Jesus and go to heaven, or you don't believe in Jesus and you don't go to heaven. It's right there for us. And sometimes people make that as a critique to us today. They look at Christendom and say, you mean if nobody agrees with you, if they don't agree and think like you think, that they're doomed and they're going to die and go to hell? You know the obvious answer to that? Yes. That's exactly what we think. Because the Bible says it, we believe it to be true. It's not that we rejoice in the fact that we would lose anybody, but it's the reality of the fact that if you don't believe in Jesus, then you don't. It's pretty simple. You want to take anybody to Beulah land with you? Wait, go get them. Go get them, because it's available. But don't think just because you don't, and no, there is that unintentional discrepancy that's there, and that's what happens in Ruth. That's what happens. You see what Ruth did, what Naomi did? I don't think she meant it. I don't think it's written this way. I don't think it's intended this way, but I think this is exactly what happened. Naomi looks at her daughters-in-law and said, go back home. Go back home to your family. And she tells us very clearly. And go back to your gods. And what's the unintentional outcome? Go back and be lost. You ever think of it that way? Go back and serve your pagan gods and be lost for all eternity. Wouldn't it have been better if Naomi had said to these girls, look, we're going to a new town, it's a new place, it's a new family, it's a new God. But come and stay with me and let us seek God together and find Him. Because really, folks, really the story of Ruth is a story of salvation. It is the story of God saving not just a person or two, but a nation. It is the story, an Old Testament view of looking at things about how God saves people, individuals and the nation. If we jump just ahead, we can go to the very end. It says this, the last few verses. Now these are the family records of Perez. Perez fathered Hezron. Hezron fathered Ram. Ram fathered Abinadab. Abinadab fathered Nahshon. Nahshon fathered Salmon. Salmon fathered Boaz. Boaz comes in the next chapter. He's the young relative that actually says, I will take Ruth. In other words, that Levirate marriage comes into play. And she will be my wife, and we'll have kids. She will be mine. And look how God blesses. Boaz fathered Obed. Obed fathered Jesse. And Jesse fathered David, the greatest of kings. I was reading about him the other day, and it said that he would be ranked with the greatest of the kings of the earth. And in his day, he wasn't ranked with them. He was the man. More than Persia or Assyria. Persia came later. More than Assyria, more than Egypt. He was the king of the world. His kingdom was not large. He was the most important man. And so that came true. And so we see how God indeed can bless. What does that mean? It means, folks, that we need to speak well, and we need to learn to witness correctly. It means that we need to have good training, we need to have good insights, because what we say makes a difference, and how we act makes a difference, and we need to be very, very careful that we don't speak and act in such a way as that we have unintentional consequences that turn people away from the gospel. When the gospel is the most important thing in the world, and then we have to make sure that we focus on that, and that we live and speak and act in such a way that these negative things are moved away. And we have to learn how to do that. First time I went to Sturgis, South Dakota on the motorcycle rally, I sat in a church, a little Baptist church out there, and this young man stood up before us to teach us how to witness. Now forgive my ego, but I'm sitting there going, son, I'm old enough to be your daddy. What are you telling me? I've been doing this for years. I know how. And I know that had I said that, he would have looked at me and said, I'm not hearing you. You don't. Because the motorcycle world's a different world. And he said some things that have stuck with me. It's things like, when you witness to them, don't try to convince them that God exists. They already know God exists, and they're scared to death of it. They're afraid of it. That's why they reject. And I thought, wow, I hadn't thought of it like that. And so, you know, by thinking of that, and by remembering that, and by knowing that, I was learning how to speak correctly to the people that were around me in order that I wouldn't do something inadvertently that would offend them and send them away. Because what we were saying and doing was designed to attract them to the gospel. Come to my town and serve my God, instead of saying, why don't you just go home and do it your way? It'll be all right. That's what Let me pose it like this. I'm going to put this in the way of people who say things like this. I've heard them, and I've heard them more than once. Missing an opportunity to witness could come about because people say something like this: let them find their own way. That's often said in reaction or response to trying to witness to children. And parents sometimes say, I'm not going to bring my kids up in the church. I want them to find their own way. Folks, when you let kids find their own way, they find the wrong way 9 times out of 10. You all know that. Anybody here that's a parent knows that. You've got to guide and direct your kids. Why wouldn't you guide and direct them to God? Why let them wander out? Why let them go back to Moab? Because that's where they're going to go. That's what they're going to drift towards. So you have a responsibility to do that. And you know, if you bear this what's the word I'm looking for? It disappeared on. Emphasis. Hard word, you know. The emphasis I've been sharing with you for a couple of weeks and will for the next couple of years is this: gospel first. It's the foundation upon which everything we do is built. And if that's true, then why would you not want to share with either children or neighbors or friends or anybody else the necessity of guiding them towards Christ and towards salvation? If the gospel is first, don't let them wander and find their own way. Help them to find Christ. The second is this. I don't discuss religion. Very often we put that into politics. Why don't you discuss religion? Well, the religion you don't need to discuss is that argumentative stuff that people get into. I agree with that. I don't do it either. I just quit. You start talking and start fussing and comparing and arguing and trying. I'm done. I quit. But I'm not opposed to discussing religion. Why? If the gospel is first, share your faith with people. Do it unabashedly. Move forward. If they don't like it, they don't like it. But folks, don't just look at them and say, go on back your own way. Go on back to Moab. Be lost. No, share with them. By all means do that. How about this one? I've heard this before. Well, we're all going to the same place. No, we're not. We can't. It's impossible. I'm not going to the whatever afterlife that the Mormons hold, or the Buddhists hold, or the Hindus hold. I put my time in here. Don't send me back as a bug. I don't need that. You know? You know what? People often critique Christians and say, you're just being hard. No, I'm not. Go to their face. They teach the same thing with different, you know. I can't go to a Muslim heaven. They won't let me in. They teach the same idea. We're not going to the same place. We're all trying to get to the same place. Well, we might all be trying, but we're not all going to make it. There is a heaven. And as a professor from New Orleans Seminary put in the title of a book, it says this: yes, Virginia, there is a hell. And so when you let people say that and let them live it and express it, you've missed an opportunity to speak up for the gospel, because the most important thing in the world is not what everybody believes, but that they believe in Christ. It therefore is the foundation that we need. And folks, what we have to do is make a commitment that in our lives, in our words, and all that we are, that we will do our best to share the gospel as Christ intended it, and that we would be bold in doing it, because if we fail to do so, we become what Naomi ended up becoming, though she didn't intend it. Can you just imagine saying to one of your family members or to one of your friends, you just go ahead and believe what you want. You just go on back to Moab. You be with your people, and you serve your God, knowing that you're sending them, condemning them to a life without God. You're condemning them to a life without salvation. Was there still hope for Orpah? Of course there was. We don't know her story. But there's a really strong likelihood that she stayed in Moab and that she worshipped false gods. Can you see what I'm trying to say to you? That your actions are important, your words are important, your lives are important, because if you don't share your faith well, then what you're doing is saying to people, just go on, live your life, and be lost. May that never be guilt that any of us have inadvertently allowing people to die without Christ. Rather, let us share Christ. The most important thing we can do. Said I mentioned who's your one. That's the whole thing with who's your one. That's it, folks. Learning another way. Being trained in it. Being reminded how to share the faith with at least one person. Let's pray.